the risks are higher, right? When you're younger, you can make a bad investment or make a less than optimal decision about taxes, and you have a lot of time to recover from those mistakes. But as you enter the decumulation phase, there just simply isn't that time. And once you enter retirement, it's a lot harder to change your mind and go back into the workforce at the same level of earnings that you had. And so undoing it or saying, oops, isn't so easy anymore. And I think of it as the stakes are higher. There's also a lot more decisions to make. So Fritz and I were talking earlier this week about a theory I had around it's not just one big decision as you enter retirement, it's 100 small decisions.
When you're accumulating, it's dollar cost average, put it in every paycheck, don't worry about it. If you get a raise, save a little bit more, right? We know how you get there. It's an entirely different strategy when you're trying to build that paycheck to come out of those investments. So it's more difficult because you're concerned, as Dana said, is it going to last your lifetime? The number one concern of retirees is that they're going to outlive their money, by the way. So it's a big concern. And then secondly, from a tactical standpoint, it's an entirely different way of managing your investments than you've managed them before. So you've got to learn a new process or hire a professional like Dana to do it for you. But it's a really different approach to how you think about your investments. Even if you're nervous about spending, learn to let it go. As long as you're within your safe withdrawal rate, what's the purpose of that money? It's to enjoy these last couple decades of your life while you're still healthy before you get into those flow, go, and no-go years. It's the die with zero mentality, right? You want to do the things that you can experience while you still got the health and spryness to go out. I did a 5-mile hike up in the Arctic. I saw this incredible ice fjord. I'll remember the rest of my life. It was a 5-mile hike. Am I going to do that 80 years old because now my portfolio is big enough I feel comfortable finally spending it? No way, right? So it's a really big mental shift from being a lifelong saver to getting comfortable spending.
Welcome to Catching Up to Fi, a podcast on mindset, money, and life for late starters of any age on their journey to financial independence. I'm Bill, and I'm a late starter.
I'm Jackie, and I'm also a late starter, and we're your host. We're here to help you on your journey to financial independence, no matter where you're starting.
We're going to talk to experts, other late starters, and explore topics related to our mission.
Join us as we catch up to Fi together.
Hello, and welcome back to Catching Up to Fi. We are so lucky today to have a new dynamic duo with us here. It's the Retirement Manifesto dynamic duo. And so imagine working hard for decades, finally reaching the finish line, and then realizing one of the real challenges of retirement isn't just stopping work. It's figuring out how to replace that steady paycheck you've relied on your entire life. That's exactly the crossroads where today's guests, Dana Anspach and Fritz Gilbert, excel. How do we build our own retirement paychecks? A reliable income stream designed to fund our freedom years without the stress of wondering where the next month's money is going to come from. How do we avoid running out of money before we run out of health span or lifespan, as we say? How do we face those fears and switch from frugal savers to secure, joyful spenders? Do we die with zero or the wealthiest corpses in the graveyard? We hope to address these questions and more on today's show. Jackie, take it away.
Yeah, well, Dana loves to translate financial complexity into what it means for everyday households. She is a CFP and the founder and CEO of Sensible Money. It's a financial planning firm that specializes in helping people live off their acorns and squeeze more juice out of the money they already have. In 2022, Sensible Money was ranked on the Inc. 5000 list of fastest growing privately owned companies in the US. When Dana began working with people in the 50s and 60s, she realized that a different type of planning was needed in order to align the finances for a transition out of the workforce. And that's what the firm focuses on. She is author of 2 books, Control Your Retirement Destiny, which we love, and then Social Security Sense. We love that one too. She has been writing as an expert on retirement-related topics since 2008, including contributions to MarketWatch, The Balance, the U.S. News and World Reports. When she's not working, Dana enjoys hanging out with her dogs, regular workouts at the gym, and slapping on her black leather to ride her Harley motorcycle. So not too long ago, she got back from yodeling on a trek in the Alps, and we'll have to hear a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I mean, we got to meet Dana at Boglehead's conference, and we immediately knew now, even 2 years ago, that we had to have her on the show. And after reading her book, I now find that after The Simple Path to Wealth gets you to the accumulation pinnacle, reading Control Your Retirement Destiny gets you into the decumulation years. And that should be a staple of our community's reading as they move on into their retirement years. But the other half of this dynamic duo, Fritz. Well, our pal Fritz, he's been on the show. He was with us back on episode 19, The Hard and Soft Sides of Retirement. Episode 19, Jackie, that's almost 2 years ago. Hard to believe we've been around that long. And so he's the founder of the Retirement Manifesto, an award-winning blog focused on helping people achieve a great retirement. He is also the author of Keys to a Successful Retirement, Staying Happy, Active, and Productive in Your Retired Years. He's an expert, as I should say, on the soft sides of retirement, not those that we're talking about today, but if not more important than the numbers, understanding your transition, your life transition into retirement. Well, he's an expert on that, and he wants to talk about that. So reach out to him to help find yourself in retirement. Fritz retired in 2018 at 55 after a 33-year career in corporate America and enjoys sharing the lessons he learned to help others on their journey. He and his wife live with their 3 dogs, lots of dogs here, in the Appalachian Mountains in Blue Ridge, Georgia, where they enjoy managing their 501c3 charity, Freedom for Fido, which builds free dog fences for low-income families with dogs on change. If you can see the YouTube, he's still sweating. His forehead is glowing because he just came back from a dog fence build to join us today on the show. He also enjoys many outdoor activities, RV travel, and spending time at their second home with their granddaughter in southern Alabama. Right now, they are living in the dust of a big rehab on their cabin and just got back from an epic cruise north of the Arctic Circle in polar bear country, and he lived to tell the tale. Dana and Fritz, welcome to Catching Up to 5.
Wow, quite the intro. Thank you very much, guys. Glad to have you. And we got to tell the people that Dana, I'll turn it over to you here, but she actually reached out to me, and you might get into this, but the reason we're together, people are like, why are these two together? We've partnered up on the Retirement Manifesto. So I'll turn it over to Dana. It was her idea. I love it. And then she can say her thank yous at the same time. Thanks, guys. Appreciate it.
Yeah, Jackie, that was one of the best intros I think I've ever heard. I'm going to script it and be like, this is the way to intro me. That was amazing. Thank you. Fritz is right. I reached out to him. I don't know, maybe it was probably around the beginning of this year. I used to write for about.com, which became The Balance, and they had a place where we could just blog a little more casually and share our thoughts. And it's something I've missed. And I turned 54 this year. And as I think about my own retirement journey, the numbers side is pretty easy for me, but Fritz talks a lot about the identity shift, and that's going to be the harder piece for me. And I thought, I'd love a place to share my thoughts as I'm thinking about this. And so I said, let's experiment. How about if I guest blog for you once in a while? So we're in this experiment together. And so far, it's been a lot of fun.
Well, you reinvigorated the Retirement Manifesto. Fritz was just like, I've been doing this 10 years. I've got such a busy life. Maybe I won't blog as frequently. And about that time, I think, Dana reached out and all of a sudden, boom, there's a collaboration going on. And that's how these things work. It's happenstance. It's 6 degrees of separation. That's how we've all met in this community. So, we're happy to see that the Retirement Manifesto is getting new blood, new information, new ideas. And we'll continue reading it and engaging with it. And we're happy to be the first podcast to have both of you on together. This is your coming out party, right?
Indeed.
We love the idea of duos. We love our little duo over here at Catching Up to 5. So we know that you guys are going to do amazing things together.
Well, let's dive in, Jackie. We talk a lot about accumulation, and the late starter does have accumulation problems. We're starting late, we have less time for compounding, and we can't make as many mistakes. We have to learn from each other, and we have to get there a little faster over a 10, 15, 20-year time course, which we refer to as the average American is a late starter. But eventually we get there. Eventually we climb that mountain. We get to our number per se. The 25 times expenses is the rule of thumb we use. And then what do we do next? Okay, we've been in a certain accumulation mindset. The life cycle of investor is earn, save, grow. So we've moved through those three cycles, and now we're moving into the preservation of wealth phase for a potentially 30 or 40 or 50-year retirement. That's really intimidating. That's just downright scary, even to me. So fundamentally, with a little bit of education, accumulation is simple in theory, if not necessarily easy. 100% equities, 1 to 3 asset classes until roughly 5 years before separation from active income or paid work. And then you transition into drawdown, which, as we will find out today, can be much more complicated and intimidating than the accumulation process. Guys, Dana and Fritz, why is decumulation so much more complicated than its fraternal twin, accumulation?
Number one, the risks are higher, right? When you're younger, you can make a bad investment or make a less than optimal decision about taxes, and you have a lot of time to recover from those mistakes. But as you enter the decumulation phase, there just simply isn't that time. And once you enter retirement, it's a lot harder to change your mind to go back into the workforce at the same level of earnings that you had. And so undoing it or saying, oops, isn't so easy anymore. And I think of it as the stakes are higher. There's also a lot more decisions to make. So Fritz and I were talking earlier this week about a theory I had around it's not just one big decision as you enter retirement, it's 100 small decisions. And how do you make sure you're making each one that put the odds in your favor of a better overall outcome? And so when you retire is one big decision, of course, but along with that are so many others. What asset do I sell? Which account do I sell it out of? When do I take Social Security? How much do I spend? Can I afford the second house? When can I buy a car? Like there's just a bajillion decisions that you make rather seamlessly on the accumulation side, but in retirement, it's like each one matters.
Spot on, Dana. I think the other thing I would add is it's for the first time, the paycheck's gone and you've got to live on these investments. So the approach that you take with your investments changes, and it's a really big change, right? When you're accumulating, it's dollar cost average, put it in every paycheck, don't worry about it. If you get a raise, save a little bit more, right? We know how you get there. It's an entirely different strategy when you're trying to build that paycheck to come out of those investments. So it's more difficult because you're concerned, as Dana said, is it going to last your lifetime? The number one concern of retirees is that they're going to outlive their money, by the way. So it's a big concern. And then secondly, from a tactical standpoint, it's an entirely different way of managing your investments than you've managed them before. So you've got to learn a new process or hire a professional like Dana to do it for you. But it's a really different approach to how you think about your investments. So I think you put those two together, and then you hear about things like sequence of return risk. Just touch on that. That's if you have a bear market shortly after you retire, it greatly increases your risk of running out of money. When you're working, it's not fun to go through a bear market, but it's actually a good thing because you're buying every month, you're buying more shares, right, for the same dollar amount. It's the exact opposite in retirement. If you're selling a certain amount of dollars to fund your spending, you've got to sell more shares when the stock prices go down. So it's a much higher risk in a bear market. I think that adds a lot of anxiety to it.
Yeah, that's one of the risks. That's a big one. And Dana outlines actually in her book 4 big ones. And sequence or market risk is one. That kind of is the 10 years that bridges that retirement date, the 5 before, 5 to 7 after, where if you have a big, deep drawdown or a long drawdown, you could have permanent damage if you don't manage that transition properly. And we'll talk about that today. Dana, the other risks you outline are longevity risk, inflation risk, and overspending risk. Can you take us through those three and why we need to mitigate for those?
Yeah, I mean, when I think of longevity risk, one of the biggest mistakes people make is optimizing for a shorter lifespan than they are likely to have. On the other hand, I don't know that it necessarily makes sense if you're 40 years old to run a plan out to age 100. And so somewhere in there is a balance. White collar workers, for example, have longer life expectancies than blue collar workers. Your family health history plays into it. But you really need to be planning for something around 85 to 90. And then I like to roll that forward. So let's say I have somebody who's 55 today and we're planning a 30-year time horizon. Well, at 56, we're still planning 30 years. At 57, we're still planning 30 years. So we will use this rolling time horizon to do our planning, which we think is a good way to find that middle ground between using an appropriate time horizon that is going to cover against these risks of living into your 85, 90 range, but not saying, oh, I want to make sure I have enough to cover until I'm 110 from day one. So just understanding how challenging it can be to get that right is what I think of as longevity risk. A lot of people say, I want to die with $1 in the bank. And we say, well, if you could tell me when you're going to go, I can make that happen. But there's a big buffer zone around that allows you to make adjustments as you go along.
I like the concept of actually looking at it in a rolling fashion. People think of these things statically. It's not like it expands and contracts or changes. A plan is already old the day after you make it, and then you relook at it, as in your case, quarterly, annually, and the fact that you're rolling it forward, and you use 30 years, a fixed timeline, but then you roll it forward each year, that's a good way of making sure that, hey, maybe if you're too conservative in your estimates, you're not going to spend enough on the front side of your retirement. So I really like that idea. I didn't see that in your book, and I like how you do that, reassessing longevity on an annual basis.
Yeah, I think it makes a lot of sense. And we have clients in their 80s. And of course, if we used a 30-year time horizon, they look at us like we've lost our minds. And so, it shortens up as we get out farther into their plan, where we have more personal conversations with them about what we think the realistic timeline should be. So it definitely changes, but the rolling time horizon works well. I think another one you mentioned was inflation risk.
Yes, correct.
Yeah, and inflation risk we didn't have for about a decade, and now here we are in the last few years experiencing it firsthand. The way we like to build it into the plans is to assume that every year your expenses go up. We use a 5% rate on medical related expenses, health insurance, Part B premiums, out-of-pocket expenses, and we'll generally use 3% on everything else, but we do adjust it by demographics. And so probably most of you and many of your listeners have seen research that shows that as you move through the phases of a retirement from go-go to then slow-go and then no-go years, in the slow-go years, your spending in inflation-adjusted terms often declines. And we see that in real life. So one of the advantages we had when we did see inflation begin around 2021 was for years we had asked our clients, hey, we have an inflation raise built in. Should we increase the deposit that we're sending you? And many of them were like, no, we're not even spending what you're sending us already. But suddenly that answer changed. Inflation came about and we had people say, yeah, matter of fact, could you increase it by even more? And we had that buffer built in because we'd had many years where we didn't take the inflation increase. So however you account for inflation, right, there has to be some methodology in there to say, I am going to need more later in retirement to cover these basics, whether it be utilities and food and gas, but I may not need as much more as the actual inflation rate, if that makes sense. I'm likely to spend more in my early years of retirement, and we can front load that by planning in more vacation and entertainment and less in the middle years. But I need to match that into my plan, or else I will, as you mentioned, be so conservative that I'll end up later in retirement with far more than where I started.
Fritz, how do you approach inflation in your planning? Is it similar, different? Do you use a personal rate of inflation? Do you use CPI? What's the difference?
Yeah, let me walk through that because it's an individual case, whereas Dana sees obviously thousands of clients and has a much broader view, but I can speak to it from somebody that's gone through the transition to retirement and I'm managing it in an inflationary environment. So basically the way I've approached it, when I did my initial cash flow to decide if I could retire or not, I did exactly like Dana said. I laid it out to age, I went to 95. So I went to age 95. I inflated my medical, ironically, by 5%. I inflated everything else by 3%. So I had a cash flow layout. And then the thing you have to remember is you've got those costs going up, but your portfolio should be returning more than inflation if you've got the right asset allocation, right? So over time, you might have a year where you get a bear market, but you have to look at the assets that you're owning and make sure that you've got enough exposure to the assets that historically have overgrown inflation. So I've got about 60% stocks, 40% bonds and cash, roughly, and some alternatives. So my hope is the equities will continue to grow to manage the inflation. But the second thing I do is I started with a more conservative safe withdrawal rate. So I use like 3.25%. When I was retiring, Big Earn was big on this, and that was kind of the number he was using. I think Morningstar was saying the same thing. So I was conservative. But what I do is every year at the end of the year, I take my net worth statement, I update it, and then I'll look at the actual, you subtract your house, you subtract your car, you subtract the things that you can't spend, and you come up with your kind of retirement funding pool. And I'll multiply that times 3, 3.25, 3.5, 4%, knowing I can go up to 4. I could probably even go up to 5 because I've been at 3.25 for a while now. So as our income needs change, if our investment portfolios continue to go up, which since 2018, it's far exceeded inflation rates, right? I can increase our safe withdrawal rate if necessary. So that's how we can absorb it, even if our portfolio has underperformed inflation. There's a buffer. So we've got a little bit of a buffer around our spending ranges, and we adjust it annually. So if our needs go up a little bit, I'm very comfortable, as Dana said, increasing our paycheck for the following year. That's how we've been managing, and it's worked fine.
Yeah, I love that because I think the flexibility part of it is critical because some people will take that 4% rule literally, and you're just saying it's a flexible number, it's a variable number. Fritz, I have a couple more questions for you specifically. So we know that you retired in 2018. You did it all yourself, or did you use like a financial planner?
100% DIY. Dana and I have had some fun on this because she had a webinar. We're like joking DIY versus professional. I'm a big fan of people hiring a professional. Trust me, this is a huge decision and you've got to get it right. So I will put the caveat in that I've been just a hobbyist on this stuff for my entire career, and I've always managed our money, so I'm very comfortable. Obviously, I've been writing a blog for 10 years, so 100% DIY from the beginning, and I'm still doing it now. Now, that said, I have set up plans, going down a rabbit hole, but it's worth mentioning. Even if you're DIY, what are you going to do if you get dementia? I write my wife a love letter every year, and I have instructions there. If I get hit by a bus, I've given some information to her on here's what I would recommend you do, and it's hire a financial planner. I give her the name of the person that I would recommend. And I'm also planning on moving our stuff to a professional when I get into my mid-70s just to mitigate that risk of dementia or cognitive decline. Anyway, rabbit hole, but it's important to think about this.
I've been thinking through that as well. I retired at 49, but I have one daughter and she's not interested in this stuff like me. So at some point I will get a professional, but I think that brings together a robust dynamic between the two of you. But I just wanted to make it clear that, you're do-it-yourselfer, but we know that Fritz is a superstar when it comes to this do-it-yourself, hobbyist, financial stuff, and so am I. But I know how important professionals are. So our audience might be a mix of the two. Bill, you're do-it-yourselfer, but you're realizing that I think in this drawdown and this second phase after you retire, you probably are going to be working with a professional. You've been doing your research.
Well, there's no shame in doing that because a lot of our friends who are in the FIRE movement put together their own plans, but then run them by a flat fee project-based financial advisor to figure out that, hey, I think I'm right. What am I missing? And how can I tweak this to make it better? There are so many ways to look at this. You don't have to be pure DIY. A hybrid model in many ways is probably the better model. We'll get into that a little more, and I hope we have enough time for that. One of the other risks that I want to touch on too, because Fritz is now renovating a house and traveling all over the world, how do we avoid overspending risk? There's a sweet spot there where we want to spend to maximum joy, but how do we manage that risk of, oh my goodness, I overdid it?
I think it's interesting because I will tell you broadly what we see is that happens far less than the people who don't spend enough. So in general, we will see that overspending isn't what we see most people do. And maybe because the types of people we work with have been really good savers. They're probably more conservative by nature. But in the cases where it happens, it was because people didn't really do a deep dive on what it would take to maintain their lifestyle. I've got a new book coming out called Living Off Your Acorns, and I tell the story of a client who was really into camping and hunting, and we had done his entire plan, and this was before I would ask for detailed spending information. And so he said approximately what he spent, and that's what we built the plan on. Well, he retired, bought a brand new truck that could haul his brand new camper, all of his brand new camping equipment, all of his brand new hunting gear. None of that was factored in, and it happened to coincide with the 2008 Great Recession. And so that put this whole plan into a constrained place where we had to be very, very careful for many, many years about the level of spending. And it was simply because it wasn't factored in. So I think there has to be that method. Fritz described his method of taking his total financial assets and multiplying it by a percentage. We have a similar process. We call it fundedness. So we're taking the present value of all of someone's lifetime expenses and comparing it to their financial assets. And it's a ratio we update every year. And what I like about that ratio is I can drop in some extra quote one-time expenses. Can I purchase that RV? Can we take our family on this big trip? Can we pay for our daughter's wedding? Some of those lumpier type expenses, we can drop it into this formula and say, well, over your lifetime, does that still put your plan in a metric that appears to be a safe range? And in that individual year, their withdrawal rate might well exceed 4%. It might be 8%. But over their lifetime, if it still works, we feel very comfortable with it. So to answer that, Bill, I think you have to have some kind of methodology that you follow each year that allows you to test. And if you're doing that, that can prevent that overspending.
Yeah, we'll get into that a little bit later after we talk about portfolio construction and monitoring. You talk about a control box. And there are things that we can control and there are things that we can't. And expenses is a big one. And how you model that out is huge. We can't control for market volatility. We can't control for longevity or inflation, even medical costs. But we do have control over a few things. And two of them you talk about are our expenses, one of which is also taxes and optimizing that. Let's take a little bit of a dive into the expense side of the equation, because we have to have this before we can even construct a plan. And getting it wrong, as you mentioned, could be catastrophic if you're buying a new house in the year of a big drawdown. So how do you look, Fritz, maybe you first, how did you look at and figure out expenses and figure out the blind spots here so you knew this is what my life really is going to cost in retirement, not just in year one, but over time, over a third, this timeline, which is really important.
Yeah, great question. And the way I look at it, and I'll explain how I did it, but there are so many unknowns in the retirement puzzle. Your spending, your current spending, if you're still working, let's say you're 2 years out from retirement, your current spending is not an unknown. It is absolutely a known. But have you taken the time to do the homework and figure out what that number is? Not too many people do. So they're saying, oh, I think my spending is going to be X. To Dana's point, I think my spending is about this. Well, you can absolutely nail what your current spending is, and you absolutely must do that. So our process, I'm not a budgeter. We've always saved off the top, and if we've got money left over, it's coming into the checking account, we spend it. And we know we're aggressively saving, so we're okay. That's how we lived. So we never really tracked our expenses. I could figure it out. If we had money in the checking account, we knew we could buy stuff. That's kind of how we live. But what we did for a full year, when I was 2 years out, 3 years out, we tracked every single dime. I'd stick the receipts in my pocket. I'd send myself an email. I'd capture every spend, and I had a spreadsheet. I did it all manually. You don't have to, but I like to see that because I can work through it. We tracked every dime for a year, and we said, okay, and we broke it into categories. Here's how much, we're paying on insurance and medical and blah, blah, blah. Broke it out by detail. And then we said, okay, let's think about how is our life going to change when we retire? Well, we knew we were going to leave the city. We were going to sell the bigger home. We were going to downsize to a smaller cabin, which we did. Okay, we're going to pay off the mortgage by doing that. So the mortgage goes away. Okay, property taxes are going to go down, etc. Utility bills are going to go down, but we're going to start traveling. Well, how much are we going to travel? I don't know. Let's say we're going to travel. We're going to buy an RV. Let's put that number in there to Dana's point. We plugged in an RV purchase. Let's say we're going to camp 50 nights a year, $30 a night. Okay, that's $1,500, whatever. We did all that type of thinking. And we built in, here's our actual current, here's our projected going forward. That's how we started. And then we took those numbers and we inflated them going forward, and we made some adjustments for slow go years, as Dana said. What's going to happen when we stop traveling in the RV, right? Oh, what if when we get older and we have to buy a nursing home? Let's put that in as a contingency. So we made educated guesses on how things would change. And then what we did is we said, okay, let's be conservative. So we know we have to buy private health insurance. Well, let's do some research. And it was coming out about, at the time, $1,800 a month was kind of what plans were. I'm going to start at $2,000. I'm going to buffer a little bit. So we build in a little bit of a buffer on the high side of expenses and a little bit of a low side on returns. If you go too far with that, you'll never retire, but we wanted to be a little conservative. So that exercise is not hard to do, but very few people do it. And that's the key to getting it right. Dana, I'd love your input because you deal with clients all the time. They're taking a swag on their spending and you can't do that.
I mean, all I have to say is 100% yes.
Yeah.
That is the way to do it. It's exactly what we do. We are helping guide people through the process, and then it's pretty easy for us to see items they missed. Items I used to see people miss, dental expenses. I mean, crowns are expensive. So on a lower income retiree, if you don't have some buffer built in to out-of-pocket medical for those kinds of things, that can catch people off guard. Medicare Part B premiums for higher income folks, we would see people miss the fact that they're going to be subject to that means testing and have to pay a higher premium. Big home repairs. We had a client, and they were in a 100-year-old home. And a year or two after working with them, they mentioned, oh, and by the way, our home is 100 years old and really nothing's been done. We need to budget. And it was obvious, it was a substantial amount of money, the electrical, the plumbing. I mean, some stuff had been done, but it's going to need a ton. And that just came up in a random conversation several years after they had started building their plan. So those can be factors that we see that people don't think about that need to be considered.
The other big one is taxes. Don't overlook taxes and don't just take a swag and say, okay, here's how much I'm paying now. I think it's going to do some homework on that, especially if you're planning on doing Roth conversions, which I strongly encourage anybody to do if they're going to be retiring before age 63, 64, depending on your health insurance and whether you get subsidized. There's a lot of caveats to that. But make sure you factor in the tax burden, because if you're going to be doing some Roth conversions, as an example, that can trigger a much higher tax rate than what you might think otherwise, because it counts as income. And you've got to account for that in your cash flow, because that's money that you're going to have available if you want to do those conversions. That's another big one that people miss.
Well, that's perfect, because we were just going to talk about taxes. There's a lot of lumpy expenses that you can miss, and you do have to plan out for them. Plan out for giving, too. We talk about dying with zero. What legacy do you want to leave at the end? What do you want to give while you're alive? That has to be in the budget, too. There are so many things that you have to think about. This is where talking to a planner or reading the Retirement Manifesto cover to cover, or Dana's book cover to cover, really becomes important, because you may think 25 times, oh, that's simple, I'll just do my household expenses. But no, the big ones, healthcare, taxes, and then all the little bells and whistles where you can limit your lifetime tax liability by doing prospective Roth conversions and maybe paying more upfront and using tax arbitrage to pay less later, so that you have more money in your pocket, the less taxes you pay playing by the rules. Dana, what kind of things do you see with regards to tax planning that people need to pay attention to so that they don't lose out on keeping money in their pocket?
The tax code is so complex, and then the new tax bill that just came out added even more complexity to it. It's kind of crazy. In the simplest terms, you can do one thing in retirement that has this compounding effect on your tax return that you never saw coming. I'll give you an example. I was on a phone bank. It was something the Arizona Republic, our local newspaper, used to do. And this guy called in and he wanted to know why he paid no taxes for several years and why suddenly he owed so much. Well, he had claimed Social Security in his 60s, and it was when the RMD age was 70 and a half, and his first RMD occurred. And he didn't realize up until that point, his income was low enough. All his Social Security was tax-free. His RMD began. It was large enough that suddenly a substantial portion of his Social Security became taxable. And this tax bill just caught him off guard. I've been paying no taxes. All of a sudden, I owe so much. What happened? That's a simple example of what can happen in retirement. You may sell a stock because you need cash flow. It realizes capital gains. You may suddenly be in a situation where that capital gain caused your adjusted gross income to cross a certain threshold amount. And now, 2 years later, your Medicare Part B premiums go up. And you go, what happened? why do I have to pay more this year? There's so many examples like that of how different parts of the tax code intersect in retirement. And it doesn't mean you can't afford it. As Fritz said, if you do the planning right, you've factored all of that in, but don't want to get caught off guard. Where we see people get caught off guard are things like Roth conversions, but they forget to make a quarterly payment for that Roth conversion, and they haven't met what are called the safe harbor requirements on how much they need to pay in throughout the year. And so now they owe penalty tax in addition to the ordinary income tax. So there's just additional planning. If we're working for someone, our taxes withheld from our paycheck, we don't really think about it much, but in retirement, you have to decide how you're going to withhold those taxes. You have to decide if you need to make quarterly payments and how much. And you have to know if you do certain things like realize capital gains or take an IRA withdrawal or do a Roth conversion, that may increase your tax liability and it may necessitate you paying in more before you file next year. So it's just more complexity.
So Dana, tax location becomes very important from a tax standpoint, right? Because they need to know which account they should be pulling out. Because if they pull out a brokerage account, they sell a stock, like you said, then that could add to their taxable income, or if they pull money out of a traditional account versus a Roth. I'm curious, because Bill kind of in this boat, and maybe even Fritz, at what point do most of your clients come to you? Do they come to you when they're ready for retirement and they're trying to figure it out? Or do they give you a little bit of runway to say, hey, I'm 10 years away, I want to start working with you?
The minority give us a lot of runway. And they will say, I'm 10 years away. And that's, to me, the ideal place to start. But the majority, it's somewhere between about 1 and 5 years away from retirement that we see people. And every once in a while, the other side of the bell curve is someone's like, I'm retiring in 3 months, help.
Right.
I
That's
mean,
usually that trigger point.
and the important thing is here, tax is a big expense. You can manage it. And you talk about tax alpha. And in your book, you talk about the importance of active tax management. And is it really possible to add 200 to 300 basis points of return a year? I mean, because these compound for you. And so there are so many rules, we can't talk about them today. But the important thing is to realize that you don't know what you don't know. And you need to ask professionals for the advice to fill your gaps in knowledge so that you don't lose out on being able to spend more, because this is what this is all really about, right?
It absolutely is possible. And the way I see it materialize is often through the combination of annual tax planning with funding things like Roth conversions and using asset location. So in simple terms, what does that mean? Well, if we've run out a cash flow plan and can see what amount of money is coming out of which accounts in which years, most of the time, the Roth is slotted last. So it's going to be for later in retirement, we're going to let that money compound tax-free as long as possible. If you know that, then you're lining the portfolio allocations up to match the cash flows. And so your Roth could remain very aggressive, in most cases 100% equity. And we can put the equities in the Roth that we think have the most potential for return. And when we look back, we have client data now for 20 years. We can see the performance by account and we see that materialize and we go, wow, the Roth returns are substantially higher than these other accounts. And that has added so much after-tax wealth over a 20-year time period. That's where that 200 to 300 basis points comes from. But it doesn't show up in terms of, oh, this rate of return. It shows up in the fact that on an after-tax basis, you simply have more wealth because of the decisions that have been made.
Oh, that's perfect. We talk about allocation, but in the tax planning, location becomes so important, and how you realize income, how you produce your income and when you produce it, and managing your tax brackets. You go $1 over and all of a sudden you hit a cliff on some things with regards to IRMA or other issues that you didn't see coming, and that can add thousands of dollars to your expenses. So the important thing here, folks, is read Dana's book, read Fritz's book. There's a new tax book coming out for FIRE people from Cody Garrett and Sean Mullaney that everybody should be reading, and we'll have them on the show. We're not trying to cover taxes here today. Just realize that you can't overlook this as an important alpha in your portfolio that you control. just like your spending.
I heard Dana mention that she was coming out with a new book. Can you tell us the name of the book and a little bit more about it so we can look out for it?
Yeah, it's called Living Off Your Acorns, Your Guide to the Four Phases of Retirement, a slightly different four phases than perhaps the way some other people frame it. So I'm talking about the pre-go years, the 10 years leading up to retirement, then the go-go years, then the slow-go and the no-go years. And I interviewed a lot of our clients in their 80s, late 80s even, to try to frame what do those slow go and no go years look like so that we can do better planning early on. I think when we get a glimpse into what it might look like later, that helps us make better decisions. And of course, the bulk of the planning occurs in the pre-go and the go-go years, and that's what allows you to relax and enjoy those later years with a lot less stress.
About when do you think that's coming out? Because we'll definitely have to have you back.
Oh, thank you. We're estimating November. So it's in content, it's in copy editing right now. So all the grammar and making sure all of that's fixed, hopefully.
Well, thank you for the early heads up. We appreciate that. Bill, I'll let you take it away.
Well, okay, so we've gone over some of the things that we can control and that we need to know going into forming our paycheck. It's a microscopic, granular look at our expenses, and not just our household expenses. It's our tax expenses, our healthcare expenses, and model that forward using inflation adjustments. So there's a lot more to it other than just the 25 times rule. And don't forget some of these blind spots that you might not have accounted for that will reduce your true safe withdrawal rate. Now, so we have to look at our income streams, okay? Before we look at the work our portfolio is going to do, if you have part-time work, which is okay in, quote, retirement, or a side hustle, you have residual income, rents, royalties, small business income, pensions, and Social Security, a very important component of the plan for all late starters, that will come off of your expenses. And then you need to look at the work your portfolio is going to have to do and how to construct it. All of these are pieces of your income portfolio, but how much work you have to do with the assets you've accumulated, paper assets anyway, and that's what we're going to talk about now, the paper assets. So when you're investing for retirement, we have three people here that two of us are working, two of us are retired, but all of us understand this process to some level, and I'm still trying to learn. So maybe let's do a couple of examples. Jackie, how do you do this? How do you manage your income?
Yeah, for me, so I'm a little bit younger. So I retired at 49. Maybe this should be listed as one of the resources, and it's your human capital. So I still do some projects, I do some speaking, I do financial literacy classes and things like that. Now, I don't count on that money, but that does factor in for me. Maybe if I use a professional, I wouldn't have screwed up so much, but I did a few things that made me make adjustments. So the first thing, I did have money in a brokerage account. So that was the first thing that I used, right? Because there was no age limit for me. So you got to think about if you're retiring early, that's an additional hurdle that you have to get over. Then I started taking Roth contributions because you can take those out at any age. And I started thinking about what you said, Dana. I want to leave my Roth to grow as long as possible. So I'm like, why am I doing this? So I shifted yet again and decided to set up a 72T substantially equal periodic payments. We've got 2 mega episodes on it, but basically I could get money out of my traditional retirement account without penalty. So that was a great option for me at my age. I was in my 50s when I set it up. So that's where my money's coming from. Is, as Dana said, it comes from multiple things. And I do have to kind of look at, okay, how do I make sure, like Fritz, money is in my checking account to pay my bills? So it does become a bit of a dance that I wasn't used to working my corporate job. Every 2 weeks, I had my paycheck in there and it was always covered. Out of the last 6 years, there was a couple of times where I got my low balance warning. Like I set it up for like $1,000 or so, but I realized I need to have more of a cushion to make sure all bills get paid without having to hurry up and do some kind of movement of my money. But definitely took a lot of getting used to creating my own paycheck.
And so, Jackie, I have to ask, and then we'll go to Fritz. How do you structure your portfolio any differently in retirement than you did in accumulation? Because that's what we're going to talk about now. lot of the fire people don't necessarily. They may go from 100% equities, say 100% S&P 500 or whatever, VTI, VTSAX and chill. And they go, okay, well, in order to mitigate things, I'll go to 90-10 or 80-20 and we'll keep it simple. But is that true diversification? Is that something you did, or did it become more complex?
Well, I think it's diversified enough. I was pretty much 100% equities until prior to retiring 3 to 5 years. I went more like maybe 80%, 85% in equities. And I still have a little small pension. Dana, maybe you see this with some of your clients. The pension was frozen, so it's not robust enough to cover everything I need, but I will have that, but I consider that fixed income. Then the rest would be sitting in some kind of like cash within my account, like a money market or something like that, something a little bit safer. Generally, I don't necessarily feel like it has to be bonds. The fixed income could be a number of different things, but I would say between 80 and 85% still equities. And of course, what I did different is that I need cash available when I need to pay my bills. And I'm not comfortable with having much more in equities that I have to worry about if the market's down. I'm taking money out of my account.
So that's kind of a systematic withdrawal DIY approach that I think a lot of simple approach that are Simple Path to Wealth and Simple Path to Decumulation, a book yet to be written, are doing. Fritz, you do it a little bit differently, and you took a more looking at our risks that we're trying to mitigate. I think we can look at our portfolio in a global household way where we pick risks that we're trying to mitigate and use our portfolio to take care of those. What did you do with yours? You said 60-40, but how does it look?
If you remember earlier, I said when we were working, we always just spent what we had in our checking account because we knew we were saving aggressively. So we could just spend what was in the checking account. So when we were thinking about how to do this, our priority was let's just make it as simple as possible. And let's just be able to live off our checking account. If it's in our checking account, we can buy it. How do we do that? Let's replicate our paycheck. To Jackie's point, every 2 weeks she used to get a paycheck, right? So once a month, we get money coming into our checking account. We get some of the known, like I have a pension, so I'm blessed. So we'll take the knowns, but then we look at the gap between the known income sources and the spending, and we look at that and say, okay, let's just, to make the math easy, let's say it's $5,000 a month, $60,000 a year. Not the real numbers, but it doesn't matter. We'll set up at the beginning of the year, I'll make sure we have $60,000 in cash minimum in a separate account, Capital One 360 money market account, and every month we transfer $5,000 into checking. Done. I don't have to worry about it. Spend $5,000 a month. If we find ourselves, to Dana's point, most people have a problem actually underspending. We can see that because if we underspend, our checking account balance starts going up, right? How do you avoid overspending? To your point earlier, Bill, that's a big concern. Well, if our checking account goes to zero, we're overspending. So it's a really simple automated way to keep your spending on track with almost no interference. Now you got to think about, okay, we're taking $5,000 out of that cash account every month. Eventually that's going to zero, right? Obviously. So what we do is we look at our portfolio roughly quarterly, but at a minimum every half, and definitely every year end I do a deep dive. And we'll look at our total asset allocation and we'll say, okay, what sector is up? Let's say stocks, because historically that's what it's been since I've retired. Okay, I've got 3 months in, $5,000 a month. I know I spent $15,000. I need to find $15,000 or something to sell to put that back into cash, to keep it a rolling 12 months of cash. That's the goal. So it's pretty easy. You just look at your asset allocation, you see what's up the most, you sell that to refill your cash, and then at the end of the year, you do the math again at your total net worth level, and you say, okay, I could spend $60,000 last year. Well, what's my portfolio done? And if I think inflation, now I might need to spend $65,000 next year. What would that do to my safe withdrawal rate based on my current known assets? Okay, great. And you set your new paycheck for the following year, and you just repeat. And it works beautifully. So that's technically how I do it. In terms of did I change things pre versus post-retirement? Absolutely. We were more heavily into equity. The other thing, as Dana said, we've moved our assets around. So now when I was working, we didn't have as much money in Roth. So to have my higher asset allocation in Roth, I had to have a lot of stocks in my brokerage account, in my IRA. I had stocks everywhere. What we've been working towards is shifting those stocks into our Roth accounts and moving the taxable brokerage accounts and to some extent IRA into lower risk because I'm going to be using those first, right? So predominantly cash in the taxable accounts, predominantly bonds in the IRA. And in there, we've gone into bond ladders. So we've got a 10-year bond ladder where every year, roughly half of our spending will mature in a bond fund. So that way, if you hold those bonds to maturity, you don't have to worry about interest rates changing because you're going to hold them to maturity. That's a big change that we made going into retirement. It was actually a couple of years after retirement. If you remember back the year the stocks and bonds both went down at the same time, that's when we kind of said, there's got to be a better way of doing this. So we migrated to this bond ladder that basically automatically refills half of our spending bucket just by those bonds maturing. So that's kind of what we did on the portfolio side in simplified terms.
Okay, so we're talking about buckets and ladders, and Dana is an expert also on buckets and ladders. And there's some interesting terms that we'll have to talk about as far as portfolio construction, because she uses the term time segmented approach or asset liability matching. Your expense timeline, and then you've got an asset timeline too. Dana, how do you structure portfolios for your clients?
Yeah, it's actually very similar to what both Jackie and Fritz just described. It's truly, in my mind, the most passive form of income you could ever have, because we're doing it all for someone and then replicating their retirement paycheck so they get it direct deposited just like it was when they were working. Now, behind the scenes, what's happening is what you're talking about in terms of asset liability matching or time segmentation. First, we've laid out the cash flows. So what's going to come out of which account in which years. And then we've used a bond ladder to say, okay, I want to cover this many years of cash flows with bonds where I don't have to worry if the market is down, that I will be forced to sell during that decline. It has both a real value in terms of, okay, I didn't have to liquidate anything during a down year, but the bigger value is one of an emotional or mental value. People understand the strategy and it seems to allow them to weather those downs with less stress. We've actually had people email and say, oh my gosh, I understand I have an 8-year ladder. Thank you so much. I know I don't have to worry about what's happening right now. Those kinds of emails, for example, during 2020 when the pandemic was starting and we saw a very quick, I call it a flash crash, but it was a very quick decline and recovered pretty easily or pretty fast. So yes, we're using, whether you want to call it buckets or ladders, we're, within each account. Now, where we run into, I'll call them sticky points, it's easy to restructure IRAs and Roths because there's no tax consequences. But we may have someone that has a lot of assets in a brokerage account. They have significant capital gains. We know we're going to need to spend those assets in a tax efficient way. So what do? Would I want to sell and generate hundreds of thousands of dollars of gains to instantly build out a 5 or 6 year bond ladder? Or are we going to take a more measured approach? And those are decisions that we work with each client on. I sometimes describe it as your money, your values, your plan. There's a lot of decisions that have a clear mathematical answer as to what's best. And then there's a lot of decisions that fall in this gray area where we would need to say, okay, we could either maximize risk reduction in your plan or maximize tax savings, but we can't do both. And so which of those is more important? And we can quantify those out and have discussions and try to decide which thing is going to matter the most. And we will have a recommendation about it too after getting to know the client. A few resources. I have a paper called The Wind Down, Managing Risk in the Retirement Red Zone. So if you just Google search that and my name, you'll find it. But it really talks about a process of starting 10 years out and how you would create a bond ladder and measure and adjust as you go forward. And everything in that paper is how we actually do it. Then you have the actual specifics. We like to consolidate withdrawals from various accounts in one money market and then direct deposit it to the client. Sometimes it's monthly like Fritz does it. Sometimes it's bi-monthly. So it truly is replicating the schedule someone received their paycheck on. And then a lot of times we call it an on-demand bucket. Maybe people were used to getting annual bonuses or exercising stock options, and that covered extras like property taxes or vacations or new cars. So sometimes we'll set aside an on-demand bucket that says, here's your regular monthly paycheck that you're used to budgeting from. And here's your on-demand bucket. So these one-off things that come up, you just send us a quick email, let us know you need X amount, and we'll send it over.
This sounds pretty complicated for us DIY folks. Ladders and buckets, and you make it look easy, and I understand it. The CD bond ladder, I get it. To adjust for inflation, you have to increase the bond, the par value as you go forward so you don't have any inflation risk, right? It's not like you're creating a level bond ladder. It's an increasing bond ladder in order to cover future expected expenses. I get that. And a lot of us DIYers are kind of like using funds, and a bond fund does put you at more interest rate risk, right?
I actually experienced that, and that's why I changed to the bond ladder, because I had all of my bonds in bond funds. I had everything in Vanguard. It was part of our 401k. It was easy. So we just had bond funds. I had stock, VTSAX, whatever. We had the basic portfolio, all mutual funds, widely diversified. And then part of that, you had kind of the big bond funds, right? We had some international and domestic, but they were bond funds. And the problem is if interest rates have taken an increase, if interest rates go up, the bond values of the bonds you're holding go down. We could spend hours on why, but it doesn't matter. It's just the same as a stock market risk. It's like selling stocks after the stocks go down. You don't want to sell bonds after the bonds go down, and you're trying to generate cash, but both of your asset classes have gone down at the same time, right? Which was very unusual back in 2020, whatever it was. So going through that exercise was like, at least for a portion of our bond allocation, let's move it into this more structured ladder approach. So we don't have that risk again of having to sell bonds after they've gone down, at least for the first, 5, 7, 10 years. That was the reason we moved to them, because you do have more risk in a bond fund. Over time, they should be the same number. But if you have to sell when they've gone down, you would lose money because you have to liquidate it.
Now, I'm guessing that these things will change a little bit, or maybe quite a bit, once Social Security comes into the picture. You have not taken your Social Security yet?
I have not. I'm planning on delaying, and we could talk about that. But yes, absolutely. Let's use my example of where I'm saying, okay, $5,000 a month, $60,000 a year. Well, let's say our Social Security comes in, it's $30,000. What do I need now? I only need 30, because I still need 60 to spend, but I just got 30,000 from Social Security. So guess what? All of my funding from our portfolio just got cut in half. So now my monthly paycheck, instead of being, go back to my example, $5,000, it's going to drop down to $2,500 because I'm getting $2,500 a month from Social Security. So that's built into our plan. And all you're looking at with these buckets and your portfolio and these paychecks, to Bill's point earlier, it's your expected expenses minus your expected revenues equals X, and X is what you're trying to fund through your portfolio. When Social Security starts, those known revenues suddenly increase. The amount you have to fund through your portfolio goes down by a like amount. So my buckets will change size once Social Security starts. Absolutely.
So Dana, also when Social Security starts, that will help manage one of those risks, the inflation risk, because Social Security is adjusted for inflation. Is it adjusted enough? Like how do you talk through that with your clients?
So you have inflation in Social Security. We use 2%. And so that's been a little light the past few years, but it was too high of an inflation rate for the 10 years prior. But that's what we use. So we typically will assume that Social Security goes up slightly less than someone's actual expenses. Another way of simply being more conservative in our assumptions, because we're using, for example, medical going up at 5%. There's a few components. For example, if you start Medicare and you're going to pay your Part B premiums quarterly, you're going to get an invoice for those. Actually, I've heard now it might come monthly. Then when you start Social Security, those are going to switch to be deducted from your Social Security. And those Medicare premiums go up each year. So there's this offset that can happen, right? Where your Social Security benefit goes up, but then your Medicare premiums go up. So this sounds complex. It's like, you know what? It is. It's frustrating how complex it is. Someone might send us a simple question like, I need $40,000, and there might be 7 to 10 things we look at. Right? Well, what account should it come from? Is there cash? Do we need to sell stocks? Do we need to do tax withholding? Will they need to make a quarterly payment? I mean, it's not simple, and I wish it was, but oftentimes every decision impacts every other. And it's the same with Social Security and inflation and Medicare premiums. They all tie together.
So we've talked about the fixed income portion a little bit, where we talk about sort of a cash bucket of 2 to 3 years expenses potentially, and then a bond ladder for anywhere from 3 to 8 years. So you've covered potentially a market drawdown of 6, 8, 10 years, so you're not succumbing to that, or a deep drawdown. How do you guys structure the growth side of your portfolio in this segmented portfolio? Because we talk about uncorrelated diversification, and just buying growth stocks is not that. Do you guys change your equity side of your portfolios moving into retirement?
My equity, as I mentioned, it was a little bit higher part of our allocation, so I actually brought it down. But the general premise, I've always been a huge fan of diversification. You can have the simple path to wealth, own 2 or 3 funds. That's okay. I'm not that simple. I like to have dedicated fund for international, domestic. I have some broken out between small value and the S&P 500 type stuff. The reason being, when it comes time to refill that cash bucket, if I've got a nice allocation of my assets held in different classes, held in different mutual funds or ETFs, I can specifically target what's done the best. So I hold individual international stock ETFs. I hold individual growth ETFs or mutual funds. But the premise is I want a little bit of everything, right? So I've got some precious metals. I've got some REITs, real estate trusts. We're widely diversified with the hope that almost no matter what's going on in the market, some part of our portfolio will be an area that we would be able to sell some assets to cover our cash, because they should not all move in the same direction at the same time.
So Fritz, since you get a pension, your pension is turned on now, right, with monthly payments. So do you still have to withdraw from your portfolio?
It's just like the Social Security discussion we had, right? Pension comes in, okay, it's less that I've got to fund, but you still have to fund the difference. Yeah, it's not enough to live on.
So once your Social Security starts, you have Social Security and pension. Will you have to withdraw anything? You're old enough to take from your traditional account. So when you are taking money out, is it coming from your traditional retirement account? Is it coming from a Roth? Is it coming from a brokerage?
We have been fortunate that we've had sufficient brokerage funds to cover our spending to this point. I've had some unexpected income, so that helped. You're right, I'm on a board of directors, which I wasn't expecting. So that's helped. But basically, my whole goal is to move as much of that IRA before tax money into Roth as I possibly can before the RMDs, required minimum distributions, are age 73-ish. Depends exactly when you're born, but early 70s. My whole focus right now is moving as much of that pre-tax money into Roth as I can, and try to use brokerage money to pay those taxes that come due as a result of that. And to this point, we're getting close, right? But to this point, I've been able to do that. The next source of funds that I'll tap is going to be that before tax. Instead of doing all of it into a Roth conversion, I'll just do some of it as a withdrawal, and I'll fill our buckets doing the withdrawals from the pre-tax. I think, Dana, you probably agree that's tax-wise, that's typically what they say is the optimum approach.
Yeah, that makes sense. And some other things that cross my mind that readers may not know are you can do in-kind distributions from IRAs and in-kind conversions from an IRA to a Roth. And in-kind simply means we're taking shares of the investment and converting it to the Roths. You don't have to actually sell and buy a new one, or we're just taking shares of an investment in an IRA and distributing it out of the IRA. So it's just something we find a lot of people aren't aware of that I think do-it-yourselfers should be aware of. Just because you have to take the money out of the IRA doesn't mean you necessarily have to sell the investment. You could just distribute it in kind.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I've had to do that. I'm one of those few fired people that have an individual stock portfolio. And I did convert some traditional IRA by choosing certain equities that were depressed and not doing well. And it was a good time to move them over to a Roth IRA. So thanks for mentioning that. That doesn't come up very much.
I'm still trying to get my head around the complexity a little bit. And Fritz with his buckets and Dana with their ladders, if we just got rid of those and used a base portfolio, well-diversified, uncorrelated, and withdrew it from it at the, say, safe max rate of 4.7 or 5%, would we be okay? I mean, is this the easier way to DIY it? Wouldn't that work the same and be easier to manage?
I mean, my thoughts are, is it likely to be okay? Yeah. Are you probably going to be fine and not run out of money? I think the answer is yes. Could you do better? I also think the answer is yes. And so the simple approach of owning a few funds and setting up systematic withdrawals is going to work fine in most market scenarios, maybe not all. There's all kinds of risks we've talked about in terms of cognitive decline setting in or a big market downturn. A small market downturn, not really going to phase you, but something more prolonged, that's where you could see that you're having to sell things at depressed values and it doesn't quite work out the way you thought. But in almost all scenarios, yeah, I think it is going to be fine. But I also think that there can be better outcomes that are achieved through tweaking some of the things we've been talking about.
And oftentimes people are so conservative that they end up wealthier at the end of their life than they started with their portfolio. Fritz, are you going to have a hard time spending all your money?
I've written a lot about this recently. Yeah, it's hard. Let me give you an example. I just mentioned that we're trying not to touch our before tax money, right? We're using the brokerage account. I wrote an article about this. If you started in 2018 with $1 million in your pre-tax IRA, and you were not going to spend that money because you're going to spend money out of brokerage. So you're still spending money, but not out of that part of your portfolio, right? $1 million. By 2025, that $1 million, based on actual market returns, assuming it was invested in stocks, was $2.6 million because the markets have returned like 15 to 20% on average since I've retired. It's far exceeded anything I had in the plan, right? So I'm a natural saver. I've saved my whole life. I've saved aggressively, and I've been reading all these articles about underspending. Hard to believe, especially with late starter mindset, but most people underspend. And I can see why, because if you're using a 4% safe withdrawal rate and the market returns anything greater than 4%, your portfolio continues to grow, even while you're retired, even while you're doing withdrawals. And that's what we're experiencing. Our portfolio is up compared to when I retired 7 years ago, even though we're pulling out consistently. So you have to make a decision. My portfolio's up. If I look at the safe withdrawal rate percentage, that can equate to a lot more dollars if your portfolio is up dramatically, which right now it is. So what are we doing about it? Guess what? That money's coming into the checking account, right? We do the math. So the checking account's growing. So you just mentioned we just got back from our trip to the Arctic, right? Why not? Let's go take a vacation, because you've got to think about, I've got safety nets. Okay, maybe I'll just wait and I'll hold it in case I end up in a nursing home. Okay, that's fine. But then the market's up again. Okay, well, maybe I'll save it in case I end up holding in a nursing home. Oh, wait, okay. And then the next year, well, that market's up. At some point, you've got buffer upon buffer upon buffer. You've got to say, even if you're nervous about spending, learn to let it go. As long as you're within your safe withdrawal rate, what's the purpose of that money? It's to enjoy these last couple decades of your life while you're still healthy before you get into those flow-go and no-go years. It's the die with zero mentality, right? You want to do the things that you can experience while you still got the health and spryness to go out. I did a 5-mile hike up in the Arctic. I saw this incredible ice fjord. I'll remember the rest of my life. It was a 5-mile hike. Am I going to do that 80 years old because now my portfolio is big enough I feel comfortable finally spending it? No way, right? So it's a really big mental shift from being a lifelong saver to getting comfortable spending. But if your portfolio is performing well, and if you've got guardrails in place that help you manage it every year, and you know you're safe in doing it, our strategy right now is safe withdrawal rate calculation, percentage of portfolio. If our checking account's up this much at the end of the year and we haven't spent it, we're giving it to charity. We're forcing ourselves to spend it. So you might as well go out and enjoy it a little bit. Maybe, we're giving more to charity. So we're doing this expansion on our house right now because we're saying when we're 85, we want to live on one level. So let's go ahead and make it a one level now and set up a nice master bedroom. And let's get ourselves comfortable, because we know our hope is we never move. We love where we live. So we could wait 20 years, but why? Why not do it now? Our portfolio's done well. We know it's within our budget to do it. We structured the project accordingly around that budget, and then we can enjoy it for 20 years. So it's a really tough balance, but we've been really working aggressively, and I've written a lot of articles about this, forcing our mentality to change, and it's finally getting easier, but it's taken me probably 5 years to kind of make that mental shift.
Fritz, I love hearing you talk about this. You've walked the walk. You're in this post-retirement withdrawal phase that we don't hear about enough. So thank you for that. That was great.
So Dana, this is an interesting question for you, because as a financial advisor, you have an AUM model. We've talked about that in other podcasts. So there's an inherent conflict of interest in encouraging and forcing and noodling your clients to spend money. How many of your clients end up wealthier at the end of life than they started? And how many did the plan fail? And then are you shooting for things like equal wealth at the end of life so that there's a giving plan along the way, like Fritz is doing? I've got to spend this money because I don't want to die the richest man in the graveyard. So how do you deal with that conflict of interest given your pay model?
Yeah, it's interesting because none of our planners are compensated based on that percentage of assets model. So we've never really seen that come up as a direct conflict, but inherently in the business model, you're right, it is. In most cases, and I just got in this dialogue with someone on LinkedIn who was quoting this flat fee model that never had any increases for inflation over 30 years. And I was like, but I have a client on an A model who has the same amount of money they retired with because every year we're like, you got to spend more, you got to give it away. Or it's just inherently what we do. And maybe it's simply because it is the only demographic we work with. It's what we specialize in. So it's just built into the conversation. If your fundedness exceeds this threshold, we are constantly talking about what are the things that matter to you. We've mailed out the book Die with Zero. Morgan Housel's coming out with a new book on the same kind of concept that I can't wait to read. So it's just this continuous, you can't take it with you. Do you want to gift to your kids? Are there charitable organizations you're involved with? I would say for us, it's just embedded into what we do because of the demographic we work with. When I see a plan where their assets, and then I have some that are so overfunded, their assets are going to double or even triple in their retirement. We're like, it's all we can do not to shake them and be like, okay, what do you want to do? What matters to you? We don't mean spend frivolously, but things that are going to make a difference. And I think that's what people really want to think about. How are you going to feel at 80 or 90 if your portfolio did double over that time frame? Is that going to feel good? You're going to pass it all along, or do you want to contribute to those people and organizations along the way?
I fully agree. And you've talked with one of my dear friends, Frank Vasquez, who runs Risk Parity Radio. And this is kind of his mission in life. And he uses the risk parity model for portfolio construction, which we've talked about in other shows, in order to encourage spending, encourage a higher safe withdrawal rate. And everybody has their own individual model, but all of us that are educated in this financial space need to learn how to make the most use of our money while we are alive, because that's what this fundamentally is about, for selfish reasons as well as for giving reasons, and planning in funding your kids' Roth IRAs or helping them with a down payment of a house, or these things that once we get there that we can do. And why wait till we don't know what happens to our money anymore after we live? The Soul of Wealth, for example, is a great book by Daniel Crosby. I look forward to Morgan Housel's book. Jackie, do you have any thoughts on this from your regard?
There was something that Fritz said that I thought was pretty interesting, in particular for our late starters. So Fritz, you had mentioned in your post-retirement that you sit on a board of directors. And I think when you're a late starter, a lot of times you have more working years and a more lengthy career, a lot of times in a certain industry. I would like to hear a little bit more about the board that you sat on, and what do you think about other people? Sometimes it's paid, sometimes it's not, but I think it just does not get talked about. When you mention it, I really wanted to make sure we shared your experience with our audience.
Yeah, no, that's a good question. As I said, we were conservative on all fronts. So we assumed zero income in retirement, because I didn't want to be in a situation where we had baked in some type of income and suddenly I felt like I had to work because that was in the numbers. So we were like, if we make any income in retirement, it's all a bonus, right? We know we can do it with zero work. It's the way to go. So I caution people to say, oh man, this sounds like a great deal. I'll just get on a board. It's great. Well, what if you don't get on a board, right? What if the board gigs last a year instead of what you're planning on 5 years or whatever? So to me, any supplemental income you get, and even if you think, oh, I'm just going to keep working, I'll work part-time. We've all read the studies, right? Transamerica came out again. It's been getting cited all over the last couple of weeks. 54%, whatever it is, more than half, 58%. 58% of people get forced into retirement earlier than they planned, right? So chances are you flip a coin, it's not quite 50-50. It's actually almost 60-40 that you're not going to be able to work as long as you think you're going to be able to work. So be really, really careful, especially as a late starter, saying, well, I'm just going to work longer, or I'm just going to work part-time in retirement. because you may not be able to, right? That's what the odds say. So that caveat aside, the way I've always looked at these types of things is build your plan accordingly. If you think you're going to work till 65 because you're a late starter, well, run a scenario where what if I get whacked at 63? And get yourself in a position where you can make it at 63, right? And then if you work an extra 2 years, okay, now you can take a trip, right? That's bonus money. That gets you over the basic needs and maybe into some of the wants. That's how I view side hustle jobs or the board job. So the board job, I was invited as I was retiring, and I had said, I'm not going to work, right? When I retire, I'm going to retire. And this guy calls me and says, hey, I've known him for years in the industry. It was in the industry I was in for 30 years, pretty high up, known around the world and stuff. And this guy called me and said, hey, we just restructured. They're looking for a guy that kind of knows the industry. There are a bunch of financial people that are on the board. They want somebody that kind of knows this industry to be on the board to help them facilitate the market stuff, right? Because they've got the financial stuff. So I talked to my wife and said, we don't need the money. Everything we planned on was not for the money. I didn't even know what it was going to pay. I didn't care because I didn't need the money. So it wasn't a question of how much they're going to pay. Is it worth my time? It was entirely a decision. Does this sound interesting? And is this something that kind of intrigues me? And do I think this would be fun? That's what I made the decision on. That's why I joined it. And I've had a blast. And probably a couple of months after I was on, they finally worked out the compensation stuff. And it's all just been a bonus. So I'm not doing it for the money. I don't care about the money, but it sure helps, right? That's why we're doing the expansion on the house and stuff, because it's money we didn't plan on. So finding a way to get supplemental money is certainly helpful, but just be really careful building it into your plan.
Yeah, I think that that's so powerful that you said yes to it without money having to be your driving factor. And even before someone retires, these things could come their way if they've been in an industry, they're familiar with the field. There's boards for almost everything. I serve on several boards. Most of them are nonprofit. Bill serves on the board. Whether you get direct compensation is another story, but you're getting something from it. It's adding a lot to your life. You enjoy doing it. So to me, that has some value of its own. So not just monetarily, but people will ask the question, what do I do in retirement? I think someone with a lot of experience that's been a leader in their field or in the community or whatever, serving on a board can be very fulfilling. I get that. I was glad to hear you say that. Bill does that. And Dana probably does that too. But I'd love to hear from you. Do you see that from any of your clients?
I do, often because they get opportunities and they want to continue to contribute to their profession. What I was going to say is that part-time income will change your withdrawal strategy. So we agree with Fritz. We like to run and test the plans as if there is no income. But then when we get into the annual decisions, we'll add the income back in, and we'll have clients say, no, I don't want you to include that. And we're like, yeah, but to calculate the withdrawal strategy and the tax impact, we have to include it, because now that will impact how much we should convert to a Roth or how much we should take out of the IRA. And so we just tell people, keep that in mind. I think it's great. Don't stress test your plan as if you have to have it. But once you have part-time income, make sure you're factoring it in and seeing how it impacts the other pieces of your withdrawal plan.
Yeah, I diverted a little bit, but I thought that was important because our late starters may be uniquely positioned to take advantage of that. A part-time gig doesn't always mean being a greeter at Walmart. There's so many fulfilling things like serving on a board that can really help some post, even before or after retirement, to answer that question, what do I do now? What a valuable way to spend your time.
Well, for our audience, or like we're doing, take your now expertise in retirement planning and drawdown strategy and go teach it to folks. Read Dana's book. If you want to DIY some of this stuff, I would actually refer you to retirement planning calculators like Bolden or Project Lab, because you can model these things out like we've talked about today. There's professional software like Right Capital or eMoney, and AI is even coming online with this too, where it helps tell you what to do with your plans. I saw in the software that you use, Dana. So there's a whole nother discussion here with regards to AI and retirement planning. So we could go on forever. We've taken such lovely advantage of the knowledge in the room here to hopefully help you get excited about planning your own drawdown strategy. There's many ways to squeeze an orange, as Dana would say, and get the juice out of your money and out of life. I hope you guys are willing to come back as guest correspondents as we learn more and more about retirement drawdown strategies, and we can dig into each of the topics that we've touched on today and only scratch the surface, so that we can help people with the optimization strategies they need in order to fit the pieces of their puzzle together. Would you guys be willing to come back?
100%.
Absolutely. It's been a pleasure.
Dana, where's the best place for people to find you? And then we'll get to you, Fritz. But I want to say a Retirement Manifesto, but you've got your own website. That's amazing. Where's the best place?
Yeah, sensiblemoney.com would be our firm website. And we have blogs. And anytime we're on a podcast, we put it out on social media and it'll get fed into the Learn section of our Sensible Money site and all kinds of resources we keep there.
Well, hopefully you'll put this podcast there with the rest of them.
It will be there.
Fritz, where can we find you?
The Retirement Manifesto, of course, or you can just Google my name, Fritz Gilbert, and I'll pop up. And shoot me an email if you listen to this and let me know you're watching my stuff. I'd love to hear from you. I love the interaction with my readers. I'm sure you guys have noticed that too. We talked about how enjoyable a board is. One of the fun things about being kind of a creator in this field is how you start getting these relationships with the people that are impacted by it. I know you guys are making a huge impact. That to me is one of the real joys of what we're doing. So thanks for having us on, and reach out if you're listening. I'd love to hear from you.
Yeah, today, folks, we've been talking to Dana Anspach of Sensible Money and Fritz Gilbert of Retirement Manifesto, the dynamic duo that are now coming to you with the Retirement Manifesto. Thank you both for being on the show, and we look forward to talking to you next week on Catching Up to 5.
So, Bill, as you know, we cannot do this show without our amazing staff and the people that help us put this on. Our social media maven is Diana Falk, and our editor is Fritz Brizard. We love them, and they keep us going.
Yeah, Jackie, I mean, this show wouldn't have the quality it has without our folks, our peeps. And we'd also like to give you a few calls to action for the show. We love our community, and we hope you love us back. If you would like to support the show and our mission to help late starters, you can do that at Buy Me a Coffee, which is a platform that allows you to make a donation. The link is in the show notes and on the website.
Check out the show notes for resources mentioned in today's show. Also, head on over to our website at catchinguptofy.com and check out our vetted resources, partners, and affiliates for discounts and their services, because we love sharing great deals.
Please share the show with others and head on over to our Facebook community to help us grow. If you prefer video, head on over to YouTube and watch the show there. We hope you've enjoyed this episode of Catching Up to 5. We would appreciate it if you could also leave us a 5-star review to help our message reach others.
And while we are financial educators that love to teach, remember that our content is for general education and information purposes only. We are not providing financial, legal, or tax advice. Always do your own research or consult a professional before making important decisions.
So, Jackie, we'll see our audience next time on Catching Up to 5. Cheers.